Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Davenant Hall Fellows Lecture. My name is Michael Riggins. I'm the assistant editor of the Davenant Press, and these lectures are really an opportunity for us to not only enrich the church with the wonderful scholarship that we are bringing to you guys through these lectures, but also to give you guys a preview of the kind of quality that is being presented to you in a Davenant Hall course. So tonight, our lecture is entitled The Birth of Secularity, Henry Moore, Metaphysics, and the Battle for God's Spirit, with Mr. Onsi Kamel. In addition to teaching courses with Davenant Hall, Mr. Kamel is the editor-in-chief of the Davenant Press. He holds a master's degree from the University of Chicago in the social sciences, concentrating in history, a master's degree from Princeton Theological Seminary in theology, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago. His academic interests lie chiefly in systematic theology, historical theology, and philosophy. His academic writing has been published in the Scottish Journal of Theology, and his popular writing has been published in First Things, Mere Orthodoxy, and elsewhere. He lives in Chicago with his wife Elena, daughter Nora, and son Fahim. After Mr. Kamel has finished his lecture, there will be a short break, and then there will be a Q&A time, in which we encourage people to submit questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of their screen. There is a chat box, but we ask people to use the Q&A feature instead. So with all of that being said, Mr. Kamel.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Michael, and thank you all for graciously attending the lecture tonight. This is my first public lecture, and in someone at the Davenant Institute's infinite wisdom, it's going to be recorded so that my first lecture, rather than, as is normally the case, occurring in front of 3 other graduate students in a back room at an academic conference with too few attendees, will now be online for everyone. But I'm actually really excited to share all of this material with you all and to hear your questions. This lecture is a kind of attempt to synthesize what I've been working on for the last year and a half. I've tried to cut most of the very technical stuff so that everyone can keep up, but it may get a little technical nevertheless. So without further ado, Secularity and Henry Moore. A year and a half before his death, René Descartes received an unsolicited letter from an admirer. The man had, quote, thrown praises upon Descartes and had so charmed him with his radiance and nobility of soul that Descartes felt compelled to respond. In the next letter, however, Descartes claimed his interlocutor's views were based on what he called prejudice, and by the third and final response, Descartes' greeting was abrupt, and he accused the correspondent of irrational attachment to his views. The man who had driven Descartes from charmed interest to testiness in the span of just 3 letters was Henry Moore, and this correspondence marked his philosophical debut. Moore wrote Descartes because he was taken with Cartesian philosophy, but in the course of their correspondence, each man developed reservations about the other's accounts of substance and space. Descartes famously defined body as extended substance, contending that only bodies are essentially extended in 3 dimensions. By contrast, minds or souls lack essential extension. As thinking substances, they exist, but they need not exist anywhere. Moore, however, followed in a long line of Western metaphysicians who assumed that inextension implied non-existence. If, as Descartes maintained, souls were not extended substances and thus had no location, and if intuition dictated that all existent substances have location, many would conclude that souls did not exist, undermining necessary grounds for belief in God. As Moore developed his views over the course of his life, he would conclude that Cartesianism was a gateway to atheism. Although Moore wrote to Descartes with questions born of his sincere admiration for the philosophical giant, by their third exchange, he found himself challenging Descartes' arguments against the spatial extension of souls and promoting the beginnings of an alternative account of substance and space. Moore's mature account would preserve long-held assumptions about the nature of immaterial reality and would, as Descartes put it disappointedly in his first reply to Moore, argue that, quote, the divine extension fills up the space in which there are no bodies. Moore developed this account over time, giving it decisive expression in his 1659 treatise, The Immortality of the Soul. Tonight, I'm interested in asking how More's fears of rising atheism and his metaphysical conservatism, by which I mean his selective but real indebtedness to medieval metaphysical assumptions about the nature of the soul, how those two things impacted his understanding of the divine nature. Forged in a time known for uncovering and attacking old assumptions and, quote, scholastic mental habits, More's doctrines of immaterial substance, space, and God provide insight into the interaction between newly challenged assumptions and novel arguments defending those old assumptions in the early modern period. How did Descartes' philosophy drive More, whose assumptions were decidedly more traditional, to innovate? And what can this illuminate about the relationship between early modern Protestant orthodoxy, what I'm calling theological conservatism, by which I mean people like More, who were not numbered among the Protestant Orthodox, but still were critical, rather, of elements of the new philosophies. How can we understand the relationship between those two sets of people and the new philosophers? And finally, can Henry More's example teach us about how intellectual transformations occur? The question hovering in the background of all of these questions is this: what is the process by which non-secularity produced secularity? The definition of secularity I'm working with comes from Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. He defines it as follows, quote, a society in which belief in God is understood to be one option among others. Let me say that again. A society in which belief in God is understood to be one option among others. As will be argued, certain of the conditions that Taylor identifies as prerequisites for this kind of world can be traced directly to the life and work of Henry More. Although never quite forgotten, More's philosophical thought has received substantial interest only in recent decades. Historians of philosophy have begun paying attention to More, first because More likely influenced Newton as Newton developed the theory of absolute space, and second because More was significant in the philosophical disputes of his own day and responsible for the introduction, popularization, and subsequent religious rejection of Cartesian philosophy in England. But More also represents in seed form a transformation in the intellectual climate of Europe that would climax over a century after his death in 1687, metaphysical revolution. He therefore deserves to be foregrounded not only in histories of philosophy, but in genealogies of secularity. So first I want to offer some reflections on what a genealogy actually is and what genealogical method is, because I think it's important for us to understand what a genealogy is actually attempting to do. First, genealogies are not mere histories. They are not mere histories. They are constructive projects within which historical narrative functions to uncover truths about social phenomena that would otherwise remain hidden. Let me say that one more time. They are constructive projects within which historical narrative, the historical portion of the genealogy, functions to uncover truths about social phenomena that would otherwise remain hidden. Genealogies attempt to perform two tasks. First, they answer not the question, what happened, but the question, how did we get here? In other words, in both the literal and extended senses, genealogies are stories we tell ourselves about how we came to be what we are, or better, how we came to think of ourselves and our world in the manner we do. It is therefore no surprise that, after suggesting a secular age is one in which the conditions of meaning can be answered purely in terms of human flourishing, Charles Taylor states that he seeks to answer the question, quote, how did this all happen? Or otherwise put, what exactly is it which has happened, such that the conditions of belief are altered in the way I've been describing, end quote. In short, what has made the world what it is? What has made us what we are? By whom were we begotten? The second task generally undertaken in genealogical projects comes into sharp relief in the Unintended Reformation, the work of intellectual historian Brad Gregory. Gregory says that he's undertaking a genealogical project in the sense that he aims to, quote, analyze long-term historical trajectories with their origins in the distant past, end quote. But Gregory's task is not limited to analysis. He seeks also to demythologize narratives, upholding the supersession of the medieval period by modernity. His genealogy will expose the pretenses of such narratives and so drain them of the appearance of authority. For genealogists, then, historical claims about what happened, serve constructive ends. In this, Gregory is just in keeping with the genealogical tradition. So Nietzsche says, to question the value of moral values, quote, what is needed is knowledge of the conditions and circumstances from which they grew and under which they developed and shifted morality as mask, end quote. For Nietzsche, the circumstances of the development of Western morality will expose it, opening up the possibility of discarding it. Genealogies then chart intellectual and historical developments to unmask the contingency of the present order and thereby rob it of its apparent inevitability or authority. As Gregory says, quote, things did not have to turn out this way, end quote. In part, tonight, I hope to contest the narrative of Gregory's first domain, religion, science, and metaphysics. The intellectual sea changes often attributed to 16th century church reform are more plausibly traced to intellectual developments in the 17th century, particularly attacks on atheism by pious Christians, Christians like Henry Moore. If genealogists wish to know who we are and why we are, we would be better served by examining Moore's contribution to a 17th century debate which flared up in response to a constellation of ideas, the immateriality of the soul, the nature of space, and the spirit of God. Before so arguing, however, well, let's briefly review what these genealogies that I'm opposing suggest as what they provide as the kind of narrative for their genealogies. So Gregory contends that scientific naturalism is, quote, deeply beholden to metaphysical univocity, and metaphysical univocity spread in part because the Reformation rejected the notion that, quote, the transcendent God manifests in and through the material world, end quote. Protestant sacramentology depended upon an implicit metaphysical univocity, likely contributing to the disenchantment of modernity. In rejecting God's, quote, real presence, a remarkably underdetermined concept, and ironically affirmed by all of the Protestants that Gregory argues helped generate secularity and modernity. But in rejecting God's real presence, the reformers presupposed an either-or dichotomy, quote, between a cryptospatial God and the natural world that precludes divine immanence in its desire to preserve divine transcendence, end quote. God and the world were in competition. Where one was present, the other was absent. On this telling, Protestantism leads to widespread nominalism and nominalism to atheistic naturalism. Gregory further argues that the Reformation inaugurated an era of endless doctrinal controversy, of irresolvable conflicts between Catholics and Protestants from the beginning of the Reformation until well into the 17th century. This argument, a commonplace in anti-Protestant polemics, goes back to Luther's own day. Feeling pressure, Luther responded, but perhaps less effectively than he might have. And the argument made recurring appearances thereafter, reaching perhaps its most effective form in John Henry Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua. In any case, Gregory argues that the reformers' inability to arrive at definitive readings of key scriptural texts made appeals to scripture functionally worthless. And what took the place of scripture in these debates was reason. Thus, the interpretive anarchy unleashed by the Reformation terminated in a rationalism that assumed God and creation were equally accessible to created reason. Charles Taylor, seeking to discover how members of a society can move from finding it virtually impossible not to believe in God to counting faith as just one possibility among others, doesn't emphasize nominalism to the same degree as Gregory, but still he contends that the Reformation sought to overthrow medieval metaphysics, quote, root and branch, end quote, leading to the world's disenchantment, a precondition for secularity. According to Taylor, disenchantment flattened the cosmos. In the pre-modern world, the cosmos was an ontological hierarchy. Humans occupied a particular level on the hierarchy. And this hierarchy and their level on conditioned what they could see and what they could know. By contrast, by the late 17th century, many figures presented the universe as a flat system. It was entirely intelligible and accessible to reason. In principle, everything could be known. The world and the God who made it were on the same level, laid bare before all-seeing reason. Unfortunately, Gregory's and Taylor's contention that the Reformation constituted an epochal metaphysical revolution does not withstand scrutiny. Richard Muller and others have demonstrated that the Reformers generally rejected nominalism and that their descendants were largely dependent upon Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle, and even Plato. The prominent reformer Peter Martyr Vermigli, for example, argued for Aristotelian epistemology and the Platonic forms, provided, of course, that Plato agreed with Augustine that the ideas are just the nature or essence of God understood by God himself. Even as late as the first half of the 17th century, the Church of England's leading divines were wrangling over the exact kind of causal power possessed by the baptismal waters in spiritual regeneration, and making informal ecumenical alliances, so to speak, with Dominicans in order to combat the Arminians and Jesuits by providing sophisticated Thomistic accounts of the relationship between grace and free will. So while it is true that the early decades of the Reformation witnessed the rise of an astonishing and destabilizing variety of religious doctrines, the period of confessionalization restabilized and homogenized religious doctrine and practice just as rapidly, inaugurating the era of Protestant orthodoxy. So the Reformation may not have been a primary culprit in the coup against medieval metaphysics, but several mid to late 17th century figures were. As Ada Palmer has noted, it was often the mainstream activities of pious humanists that led to reimagining how Christianity and classical thought relate, paving the way for more radical religious and rationalist movements in the 17th and 18th centuries. In some cases, it was fear of radical religious and intellectual movements that drove pious Christians like Henry More to revise aspects of the old metaphysical order. Metaphysical novelty resulted from the desire to defend older conceptions of orthodoxy. Let's see. So David Leach, in his phenomenal book, The Hammer of the Cartesians, locates Henry More through his influence upon Newton and Clarke as a major figure in the production of a key shift separating modernity from its predecessors. The movement of an analogical understanding of divine being, in which God transcends creation and human speech must therefore be predicated of him analogically, to a flat one, in which human epistemic access to God and created realities is identical. I will argue that More's innovative doctrine of God, which depended upon his novel theory of space, was developed to preserve a traditional intuition about substance, all in the service of shoring up the plausibility of theism. In other words, no longer able to take the extension and spatial location of immaterial substances for granted, owing to Cartesianism, and no longer willing to appeal to the medieval polymerist articulation of the soul's location, which we'll talk about later, owing to fierce critiques of it made by the new philosophers, More nevertheless desired to preserve key elements of the pre-modern metaphysical order, chiefly the essential spatial location of immaterial substances. More dedicated his life to developing an account of Christian theism that could withstand atheist attack, even writing a book entitled An Antidote Against Atheism. And yet this very dedication drove him to posit that God was on the same ontological plane as the creaturely order. Thus, More can help illuminate the process by which conscious defenses of old assumptions can generate intellectual innovation, and even, in this case, paved the road to secularity. Of course, such a result was diametrically opposed to More's wishes. He developed his philosophy of spirit to make theism more plausible, and his philosophy of space was developed as part of his account of spirit. Contrary to his expectations, however, More's philosophy of spirit did not gain significant traction, but his theory of space caught on in the work of Newton and Clarke, a combination which, as will be shown below, increased the plausibility of atheism. This reinforces Ada Palmer's argument that intellectual historians must refrain from attributing intellectual transformation to the intentions of the actors who generate change. But still, we must go even further. Although crucial intellectual transformations are often unwilled and unintentional, It is not correct to presume, as Gregory, for example, does, that the unintended consequences of an idea result from the success of that idea. For Gregory, it is the success of Protestant sacramental theology that generates, quote, metaphysical univocity as an unintended consequence. But as the case of Henry More demonstrates, ideas affect dramatic change even when they are not adopted and even when they are opposed. In More's case, this happened in two ways. First, as David Leach points out, More's atheist constructs, that is, the atheist arguments that he developed just so that he could defeat them with his own arguments and show atheism to be irrational, contributed to the creation, quote, of real and avowed atheism only a few generations later. The atheistic ideas More developed were adopted against his intentions and even against the expectations of his friends and interlocutors. Second, within a decade of his death, even Orthodox theologians began arguing that More's positive articulation of God's nature was liable to atheism. His account of space was widely adopted, but his account of spirit was not, ultimately making theism less plausible to those who followed him. Intellectual transformations can therefore not only be unintentional, but even anti-intentional, arising because the ideas constitutive of the transformation are opposed. The failure of ideas generates intellectual change just as surely as their success. Okay, let's move into More and Descartes. Briefly about More's religious and intellectual context. As More's growing up, the Church of England is decidedly Reformed and Protestant in its orientation, but it's also metaphysically traditionalist. And this combination of Protestantism with traditional metaphysics lasts well into the first several decades of the 17th century. So it's little surprise then that More's well-off family, the Moores of Lincolnshire, was devoutly Calvinistic. More's education reflected his family's high station. Cambridge followed Eton. In an autobiographical excerpt included in an early biography of More, More describes both his firm rejection of Calvinism and his unshaken conviction in, quote, the existence of God, as also of his unspotted righteousness and perfect goodness. At Cambridge, More read medieval mystics like Marsilio Ficino and Platonists, medieval mystics and Platonists like Marsilio Ficino and Plotinus, concluding that the soul's purification precedes its illumination. Knowledge, he would conclude, is valuable only if it serves growth in virtue and obedience to God. But even so, More was extremely confident in reason, even by the standards of his own day. Understanding the role of reason in More's thought and the thought of his contemporaries is critical for making sense of his innovations in physics and metaphysics following his engagement with Descartes. More's generation and its immediate successors believed philosophy to be central to apologetics and even indirectly to salvation. Descartes puts the matter this way in his introduction to the Meditations on First Philosophy. Concerning the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, quote, it seems there is no religion and practically no moral virtue that unbelievers can be persuaded to adopt until these two truths are proved to them by natural reason. More, likewise, held the existence of God to be perfectly evident and as rationally demonstrable as any truth. In holding to these views, More was hardly unique, but he went far beyond the standard position and argued emphatically that, quote, the notion or idea of God is as easily known as any in the world, end quote. Not only the existence of God, but also a comprehensive understanding of the divine nature are within the realm of the rationally demonstrable. Traditional, that is, orthodox divines utterly rejected this position. The Puritan Richard Baxter argued, for example, that not only were there truths above reason, but also that the nature of God was one such truth, owing to the, quote, infinite distance between God and man, end quote. But More's contention that the divine nature was as rationally demonstrable, comprehensible, rather, as any created reality, entailed that new philosophies and even physics could threaten the coherence of Christian claims about the divine nature. And one new philosophy in particular was a wolf in sheep's clothing, promising piety while delivering impiety. So briefly on Cartesian physics, we're going to look at space. Although theologians and philosophers with more traditional leanings disagreed among themselves about whether Descartes was revolutionary or recapitulating older philosophical commitments, there was a clear sense among the Reformed Orthodox theologians that Cartesian philosophy was dangerous, owing in part to Descartes' claims concerning extension, the relationship between substances and space, and the implication of these claims for his doctrine of God. Descartes contended that humans have a particular and a general conception of what he called internal space. And he gives the example of a stone to illustrate the difference. According to the particular conception, we regard extension as something inseparable from whatever the object is. So let's just see here. I've got a pen. So according to the particular conception, extension just is the place of this pen. So when the pen moves, we consider the pen's extension as having moved. But in the general conception, we think of extension as continuing to exist, as the place where the pen used to be, even though that place is now occupied by wood or water or air or some other body, or is even supposed to be empty. So if I move the pen, we can point and say, well, the pen used to be there, but now my finger is there, something like that. In this general conception, extension is thought of as persisting, provided it retains the dimension and location relative to surrounding bodies which the stone formerly occupied. But Cartesian space, technically, is just the three-dimensional extension of bodies. And humans abstract or generalize from these bodies to form a conception of space apart from them. But in reality, space is just the body, which is said to be in place. So all of us, kind of grow up in a post-Newtonian world where we think of objects as moving through space. But Descartes doesn't see motion like that at all. He thinks that motion, that space isn't something that objects move through. Space just is the sum total of matter in the world. And objects don't move, properly speaking, through space from one place to another. Rather, they simply transfer. They kind of like rotate around other objects. They transfer from the immediate vicinity of one set of contiguous bodies to the immediate vicinity of another set. So it's kind of difficult to get a handle on, but that's actually really important for More's argument. Descartes' view of space didn't concern his opponents in isolation, but mostly when combined with his view of immaterial substance. So Descartes argued for two kinds of substances, bodies and minds. He defined bodies as extended substances, that is, substances which have dimension. Departing from the scholastic tradition, Descartes denied that minds were essentially, that is, according to their essences, extended. More termed this position nullivism, and he contrasted it sharply with scholastic Hellenism, which held that spirits or minds have extension, albeit not as corporeal substances do. Just to note, there is some debate about whether Descartes did in fact abandon Hellenism. Pasnow, in his massive and brilliant book Metaphysical Themes, argues that Descartes actually upholds this medieval tradition. But what matters for our purposes is that More thought Descartes abandoned Hellenism and developed an entire term to describe Descartes' position, which he contrasted with this other term that he invented to describe the medieval position. Many traditional theologians thought Descartes' nullivism entailed a denial of God's omnipresence. Descartes disagreed. In his correspondence with More, Descartes affirmed that God was extended according to his power rather than according to his essence, because his power exists, or, quote, is able to exist in extended being. But Descartes' claim that God was omnipresent according to his power just further alarmed the Protestant Orthodox, who became concerned that Cartesianism led to Socinianism by imputing finitude to the divine being. But in short, Descartes' metaphysical innovation, the claim that thinking substance is not essentially extended, challenged the dominant model for understanding not only the mind-body relationship, but also the God-world relationship. It was a commonplace in ancient and medieval philosophy to hold that in the main, quote, whatever exists, exists somewhere, end quote. That's how Pasnow puts it in his book. More was hardly innovative in holding to this view, and indeed, it's among his most traditional intuitions. The scholastic authors did not straightforwardly assert that everything extant must have location, for God had no spatial location prior to creation, but it was generally agreed that everything extant, including God, was extant in some locale. More went a bit beyond his predecessors and denied that an object without extension was anything more than a, quote, mathematical point, which is nothing but a pure negation. More supposed a concept of spirit which posited its aspatial existence would, owing to its absurdity, undermine belief in spirits entirely. Here's what he says. He says, quote, the greatest and grossest obstacle to belief of the immortality of the soul is that confident opinion in some, as if the very notion of a spirit were a piece of nonsense. So when he writes his book, The Immortality of the Soul, he's trying to prove that spirit is a coherent concept. And he's trying to prove this against figures like Hobbes, who shared More's opinion that non-extended substance couldn't exist. It was absurd. But Hobbes also agreed with Descartes that spirit had to be thought to be not extended. And from these two incompatible premises, Hobbes concluded that only matter existed. So to defend the coherence of the existence of immaterial substance, More was driven to develop a conception of spiritual existence that was novel in key respects, but rooted in the traditional conviction that all that exists somewhere. But this, in turn, his new conception of spiritual existence, required a new view of space, and Morean space would demand a radically revised doctrine of God. One of More's most comprehensive discussions of the nature of spirit can be found in Book 1 of his 1659 work, The Immortality of the Soul. There, More defines substance as follows, quote, extension and activity, either connate or communicated. Extension and activity, either connate or communicated. But notice, he defines substance, all substance, as extension. So from the beginning, More is firmly anti-Cartesian, rejecting the existence of non-extended substances. More is quite clear on this. He writes, quote, all substance has dimensions. That doesn't mean that there aren't multiple kinds of substances. So there are two first kinds, bodies and spirits. And he says that body is impenetrable and divisible substance. Spirit, by contrast, is penetrable, but indivisible. So bodies, the key distinction between bodies and spirits is that bodies are impenetrable substance. So, you hit your hands together, they don't move into each other, they repel each other, right? They bounce against each other. Spirits, by contrast, for More, are penetrable. So the body can actually move through spirits, and spirits can move through each other. But spirits are also self-moving, self-penetrating, self-contracting, and capable of moving and changing matter as well. So he sees spirits as vitally united to bodies. So your spirit is literally three-dimensionally extended throughout your body. That's More's view. Apparent in this set of definitions is More's insistence that spirits exist in space, extend in three dimensions, and move matter by virtue of their presence to and action upon it. So More has tweaked but ultimately reinforced a basic assumption of scholastic metaphysics. Incorporeal substances essentially exist in space and so can be united to body in its essence. I wanted to do a brief discussion of Hellenmerism, but I'm not sure. Well, I think we have time. I'll do it quickly. So one important point of contrast between More and the Hellenmerian position, which is the kind of dominant medieval view, is that More doesn't believe the whole soul is in every part of the body. So just let's slow down and think about this. So on the Hellenmerist model, the entirety of a spirit or mind is in every part of the body which it forms. It exists in its entirety in all parts of the body to which it is united, but it's also entirely present to the whole of the body. So in rejecting this position, More and Hobbes were actually in agreement. They both thought this was absurd. And Hobbes even, asks in Leviathan, kind of sardonically, quote, can anyone think that God is served with such absurdities? And he says, is anyone really, is God really served when someone asserts that the entire soul is in the tip of my pinky finger? No, he said, that's just insane. God isn't served. But this Hellenmerist position has an ancient pedigree. It's articulated clearly in the works of Plotinus and in Augustine, in De Trinitate and in Confessions. And Hohenlorism took on special importance in the medieval period as a solution to the kinds of problems encountered by Occam and other scholastics, who had to account for the fact that the soul could be the form of the body. So remember, the soul is the form of the body, this kind of traditional Aristotelian notion, and thus the soul is immediately united to the body, but the soul had to be able to preserve its identity as the body changed. So for example, if the soul is the literal form of your body and you get your hand cut off, the form of your body has changed. Has your soul changed? That's the sort of issue that Occam is trying to wrestle with. And his solution is no, because the entirety of your soul is in all of the other parts of your body as well. So Hobbes concludes from all of this that the very notion of the soul is impossible. Descartes departs from the scholastic tradition by arguing that the soul is its own substance, meaning that although united to the body in some sense, it was ontologically independent of the body and whole apart from it. Thus, Descartes writes, quote, "Although the whole mind seems to be united to the whole body, if a foot or arm or any other part of the body is cut off, nothing has thereby been taken away from the mind," end quote. But how did More account for the unity of the soul to every part of the body without positing a change in the soul every time the body changed? His solution was called essential spissitude. An essential spissitude is a mode or property of a substance by which it is, quote, able to receive one part of itself into another. It's able to receive one part of itself into another. So More thinks that, like, if your hand gets cut off, you don't lose part of the soul because the soul retracts. It actually retracts itself back into itself. So your hand gets cut off and your soul pulls back. So now you still have your whole soul within your body because it's sort of turned in on itself and reeled itself in, so to speak. So More's conception of spirit sidestepped Hobbes's criticism about the absurdity of non-extended substance, because it is extended, it has three dimensions, but it also avoided a position that entailed the spirit changed with the body's changes. Okay, so now more on space, and I'll try to move a little bit more quickly now. So from More's claim that spirit is extended and in place, it follows that space must be really distinct, not simply notionally distinct, from matter. So space must be capable of providing spirit a place to be, whether matter exists or not, right? Because if spirits exist in three dimensions and they can move, space has to be able to account for that kind of existence and motion, even if there's nothing material in the world. So More developed a theory of space capable of accounting for the spatial location of spirits. He argued that space is, quote, immobile extension distinct from matter, end quote, and is thus real. But he also argued that spatial extension is infinite and indivisible. So space is just pure extension and it's immobile. It doesn't move, we move through it. Things move through it. So if space is infinite, meaning it is everywhere, if it's indivisible, meaning it can't be broken apart, and if it's immobile, meaning that neither the whole nor the parts can move or be moved, then it follows that objects must move through space, which renders space penetrable. Space then is immobile, indivisible, penetrable, and immaterial. Does that sound like anything More has defined for us before? Space is a spirit. Space is a spirit. But not only is space a spirit, More also argued that space has existence from itself. He calls space boundless and uncircumscribed in his Enchiridion Metaphysicum. It's uncreated. It's truly omnipresent. It's incorporeal, but it's simultaneously substance. It's being subsisting of itself. It permeates everything. And finally, it is actus purus, because from itself, it exists necessarily. The qualities More attributes to space are, of course, attributes classically ascribed to the Christian God. Like God, space is immaterial substance. Like God, space is infinite. Like God, space is necessary, a thing that cannot not be understood to exist once one understands what it is. More's opponents were aware of More's quandary, countering that if space, quote, or this intimate place be a real being, it is impossible but that it be God. Nor is it possible, however, that it be God, since then it would have material extension. So More had developed a novel account of God. Rather than positing a God who created and existed outside of space, More contended that the human notion of space just is a dim reflection of God's omnipresence. God is space, and it is human incapacity rather than any deficiency in space itself that causes humans to think this unbefitting of God. In short, then, More's account of space entailed a radical revision of the doctrine of God. Strikingly, More makes a similar argument about time, and in The Immortality of the Soul, he's forthright about his understanding of God's relationship to time. He redefines eternity by saying that he means by it, quote, nothing but duration without end or beginning. And I think there's even a point there where he says that even if creation, even if God had never created, there would have still been days and months and years, because God is endless duration. So More's innovations in the doctrine of God brought God within the realm of creaturely existence, not within space-time, but as space-time. So what followed from this? God could be known in precisely the same way as any created reality. More inveighed against the traditional position in The Immortality of the Soul. The knowledge of God is thrown into disrepute by the, quote, stupidity of either superstitious or profane men that please themselves in their large rhetorications concerning the unconceivableness and utter incomprehensibleness of the deity by way of a devotional exaltation of the transcendency of his nature. Instead of such lofty rhetoric about God's existence outside of nature, More contends that God's idea or notion, quote, is as easy as any notion else whatsoever, and that we may know as much of him as of anything else in the world, end quote. God can be known as any created reality can be known, and on precisely the same grounds. God is immaterial substance, just like all of the other immaterial substances. God and creation belong to the same genus. More's claims about God's relationship to space, time, and the human capacity to understand God's essence marked a stark departure from the medieval and early modern Orthodox Protestant traditions, which held God to be sui generis, a being beyond all being. In his discussion of God's relationship to space, Thomas Aquinas contrasted God's mode of presence with creaturely modes. God cannot be said to be in place like bodies, which are in place, quote, by contact of dimensive quantity, end quote. On the issue of univocal predication, even Descartes forcefully denied univocity on the grounds that divine substance and created substance have nothing in common. On the issue of eternity and its relationship to time, the medieval and early modern Protestant Orthodox traditions held that God's eternality is his existence outside of time. Divine infinity is not, quote, the endless extension of categories of finite being, as Muller says, but the transcendence of those categories. Thus, More's predecessors and traditionalist contemporaries, and even Descartes, posited that God was beyond the limits of the finite order in two of its categories of extension, temporal and spatial. For them, God exists apart from spatial extension, and eternality just is existence outside of time. For More, by contrast, God is spatial extension, and eternality is unending temporal progression. God's existence and essence are, therefore, just as accessible to human reason as space and time, for the two are ultimately the same. Henry More flattened the cosmos. Thank you.
Thank you, Onsi, for that lecture. That was wonderful. Okay, let's take 2 to 3 minutes to think of some questions and submit them through the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And then I will sort through them and Onsi will answer them. Okay, let's see. We've got a few questions, so let's start with these. So someone wants to know, in formal terms, is Henry More a heretic?
I certainly think that he taught heresy. I'm not willing to pronounce. I mean, so my own view is that it's the church's business to pronounce whether someone is or isn't a heretic. And, provided that individual has been, warned that he's, being heretical and so on. It's complicated because Moore thinks he's defending theism from atheism. I mean, he really, so he's clearly pious in a sense. He's clearly pious. So he writes an entire book against atheism, and he even writes a Kabbalistic reading of Genesis 1 through 3, which is called Conjectura Kabbalistica. And in a letter to his close associate, Lady Anne Conway, he says that he thinks a literal reading of Genesis 1 through 3 contributes to atheism by making religion seem an obvious, what he says, quote, obvious fable. So I think Moore devotes a lot of his energies to combating atheism, but I think that his view of God's existence is certainly, qualifies as heresy by any sort of traditional, classical theistic doctrine of God. Yeah. But I'm not willing to say that like he's a heretic, right? Because it's not clear to me what he knew or was made known to him by his opponents, and it's worth insisting that Moore's mature years are spent. Everyone is terrified of atheism and sort of doing whatever they can to combat atheism, and it's not clear to me sort of how to put it. It's not clear that the truth was sort of well established enough outside of the Protestant Orthodox circles to really make someone morally culpable in a way that you might think a heretic of prior centuries was culpable. That makes sense.
Someone else wants to know, how much do you think Moore's flattening of the cosmos was just the popularization of the univocity already being argued for by Occam, for example?
It's not really a popularization in the sense that Moore is an academic and he's writing to and for other academics, but maybe that's just kind of being pedantic. So I'm sorry if I'm just being pedantic. But I think there are a couple of things. So first, Moore holds to univocity on different grounds, I think, than some of medieval predecessors. He holds to it on the grounds that God is a spirit just like every other spirit. And this is connected to his physics, right? Because his physics, he argues that space just is God, or that space is a mode of God. He'll say in his 1671 edition of his Enchiridion Metaphysicum, that space just is a mode of God. And certainly, the medievals are not arguing that. Even the medievals arguing for univocity are not arguing that. And they're also not opposing Hellemerism either, right? Occam was a Hellemerist just like everyone else. So I think, for Moore, this is connected to a lot of other issues. His commitments about God don't sort of exist, just sort of about God's rational comprehensibility, don't exist apart from his other views. And we're in fact opposed to the dominant positions on both, if we want to speak anachronistically, his left and right flanks, right? Like Descartes does not think that God can be known just as easily as any other substance. Descartes does not think that God and human souls belong to the same genus, and neither do the Reformed Orthodox. Neither do Puritan divines or the other Reformed Orthodox non-Puritan divines. So Moore, I'm not saying he's absolutely unique, but he's certainly staking out a less popular view for the time, and so I'm unwilling to say that there's some sort of clear genealogical, like there's some clear line from Occam to Moore. Moore doesn't seem to engage that much with Occam, if at all. I haven't found a single reference to Occam in Moore's works or to any Occamists in Moore's works. Almost none of his main interlocutors are alchemists. So, oh, I do see one question. I want to answer one question. Real quick, it popped up right in front of me, but it's Matt Colvin's. Is there any biblical warrant for thinking that space is God? The warrant that they're going to use, that more loves the verse. I mean, everyone loves the verse, but more really loves the verse that in God we live and move and have our being. So more interprets that as we move through God, we live in God, we have our being in God. We sort of so that would be his scriptural citation in defense of his view. Yeah.
Thank you for answering that one. I was getting ready to ask you that one.
Okay.
There are several in here. Several people want to know about the relationship between More and Isaac Newton. And so one person wants to ask if More's influence on Newton is important in creating the divide between Christianity and science.
I mean, I don't think so on that issue. I mean, so I should be clear that I have focused my studies on More and Descartes. I don't know a ton about Newton. And, there's still some debate about how clear it is that More influenced Newton. I think David Leach in The Hammer of the Cartesians and Jasper Reed, I think his book is The Metaphysics of Henry More, they really argue for a clear kind of causal, at least one of them argues for a kind of clear causal relationship where Newton is dependent on More. There are some scholars who still dispute that, but it seems incontrovertible from what I've read that Newton read More. I mean, everyone was reading More. More was like one of the most prominent philosophers in England during his lifetime. So everyone's reading More, everyone's engaging with More. But I mean, the science and religion thing, like More says what he says to defend religion. Newton, I mean, deeply pious man in his own way. Again, I'm not vouching for their orthodoxy or whatever, but for their orthodoxy, but they're deeply pious people in their own way. And in fact, More towards the end of his life kind of loses interest in metaphysical disputation and starts writing kind of proto-pietistic works about the devotional life and loving God and the purification of the soul and stuff like that. So, that sort of question is hard to answer, but I think I would say, probably no, that they're not at least intentionally responsible for the division between science and religion.
There are a couple questions in here about, they'd like you to say a little bit more about these genealogical projects that we spoke of. So here's one. Do genealogical projects necessarily unmask the contingency of any narrative? Are genealogical projects truth-finding, or are they just designed to construct an alternative narrative, which is just as contingent and discardable?
That's a good question. I mean, so when I argue that genealogical projects are projects that exist to unmask and relativize something, that's not to say that the histories they tell aren't true. It's just to say that we should be aware of the use to which they want to put those histories. And I think generally the idea that a lot of genealogists are working with, the implicit assumption, is that historically contingent truths can't be necessary truths. And so if we can show that something is historically contingent, that it has a kind of process of development that is not opaque, that we can sort of see through, so to speak, then we can start relativizing it by making essentially the things that we take for granted. Maybe this is what I'm putting it. By making the things that we take for granted the subject of a set of historically of contingent historical causes, we don't have to hold them. We don't have to assume them anymore. We can sort of start. Now, I mean, there's like a lot of metaphysical assumptions. There are a lot of metaphysical assumptions kind of baked into that assumption, right? It's not at all clear to me, for example, that the fact that something arises in a culture, that a certain set of assumptions arise in a culture by means of historically contingent circumstances, and historical causes, that in any way relativizes the truth of the claim, or should cause us to seek to discard the truth claim being made. Like, that's not obvious to me, but I think that's sort of what's being assumed generally in genealogies. Taylor is less explicit about this from what I remember in A Secular Age. But I certainly think a not unfair reading of Taylor would be, Taylor is trying to explain to people of his own class and, with his own sort of intellectual assumptions, why they think the way they think, so that they don't think their assumptions are self-evident, right? I mean, that's not, I don't think that's an unfair reading of Taylor. So I'm not, maybe some genealogists don't do this. It's just that the ones that I've read, the very prominent ones that I've read, have done it. And I'm not sure that I grant the sort of implicit assumption that, if you can say with Brad Gregory, things did not have to turn out this way, then all of a sudden you've kind of made a further claim that the way that things turned out, isn't right or something. That just seems not to follow, in my view. So that's what I would say. Hopefully that was an okay answer.
Let's see. There are several questions on along those same lines of how people were reacting in their reading of More. There's one on Jonathan Edwards and Henry More, one on Gottfried Leibniz and Henry More. Were you able to speak to any of those?
So, I mean, on Edwards, I confess I know almost nothing about Edwards. There are people, I don't want to name them if they don't want to be named, but I know people who are working on Jonathan Edwards, and his sort of adoption, I think particularly early in life, although I'm not entirely sure, and his sort of dependence on More. So I think Edwards was an early admirer of More, from what a friend of mine who's working on this has told me, and adopts a lot of his metaphysics and his physics, especially stuff about space, I guess. But I don't know Edwards well at all, and so I can't really speak to that. But there is a clear connection between More and Edwards, certainly, and there's work that is being done on that, research that's being done on that we'll hopefully start to see the fruits of in the coming couple of years. Yeah.
Someone else asks, doesn't this More Descartes story in fact support Gregory's contention that Protestantism contributed to secular modernity, foregrounding reason?
Wait, sorry, where is that?
This is by Stephanie Kamel.
Oh, okay, yeah. Doesn't this More Descartes story in fact support Gregory's Protestantism? Yeah, in the sense that More was a Protestant, but I mean Descartes was a Catholic. Although Descartes actually has a much lower view of reason than More with respect to God. So More is a Protestant, but it's precisely in his rejection of the kind of traditional Reformed Protestantism that he was brought up in that he arrives at these views. Like the Protestant Orthodox, who were the kind of leading religious figures in the Church of England during More's upbringing, and in the last several decades of the 16th century, are very metaphysically traditional. So I had to cut some of the biographical stuff, but basically when More gets to Cambridge, everyone is like doing Thomistic, like scholastic metaphysics. And then by the time More graduates from Cambridge, that's kind of passé, and now everyone's doing like Neoplatonism, right? But it's a shift that happens. It's a shift that happens in Gregory's telling. It's the Reformation which does this. But my point was to say, well, the Reformation, the first few decades, things start kind of settling down by the late 1530s, 1540s, doctrinally speaking, and in many places are settled down even before that. And for the next 100 years, you have very kind of metaphysically traditional standard stuff. And then it's a kind of reaction against that happens in both Protestant and Catholic countries that kind of starts a lot of this stuff. Yeah.
Okay. This is kind of a longer question that I'm going to read. So if you want to read along with me, it's the very first one in our.
Okay.
So even if More's account of God equals space is true, how does it follow that God can be known like any other creature? Space is unbounded and seemingly infinite. It can't be observed directly by looking at other substances which occupy it. At most, you can study small subsets of space, those which are accessible to us. So it's utterly like any other substance. It seems like More took a logical leap there.
So, a couple of qualifying remarks. More thinks that God can be, how to put it, maybe put it this way. So Descartes has a distinction between ontic infinity and ampliative infinity. Ontic infinity is reserved for God alone. And the distinction for Descartes is that ampliative infinity is, in ampliative infinity, the parts are logically prior to the whole, to the entire infinity. And the infinity is composed out of finite parts. So think of like numbers. A number line might be infinite, but it's composed out of discrete, segments of a line and numbers that kind of all add up to infinity, right? It's like the parts are logically prior to the whole. More, as far as I can tell, doesn't adopt that distinction. So he certainly thinks that like no human mind is capable of grasping infinity, but he does think that God is a spirit, just like every other spirit. I cut something from the talk where More talks about exactly in what sense he means that God can be known just as much as creatures are known. And he says that God can be known in the same way as creatures. And he says, now think about it, with creatures, we don't actually see their substance. All we see are their accidents. We don't see the spirit. We just see the spirit's effects. We just see, And he says the same thing with God. We don't see the spirit, but we see the effects of God, around us. But More also thinks that we can have a kind of intellectual apprehension of infinity. One of the arguments he gives that space is infinite and that God is infinite is that when we conceive of the absence of all material reality in our minds, so if you're imagining in your mind blackness, just kind of emptiness, you imagine it as an infinite expanse, right? Like you cannot actually imagine no space. So that's one of his arguments for the infinity of space. He has another argument which is a little more technical and depends on like Cartesian, some Cartesian premises that we don't need to get into here. But so I guess all that to say that I think More is there's a lot more that More says about how exactly we can even know substances, which might sort of help address some of the concerns that he's making logical leaps. Because he doesn't think we have immediate access to any substance. He thinks that we only have access through the effects of the substance in the world. So.
Good. I don't mean to put you on the spot here if you can't recall, but it's an interesting distinction between ontic and ampliative infinity. Do you know where in Descartes' writings that is?
I have my notes for just such a question. Although I think in my notes, I get it from a paper, but it is in, I'm trying to remember. It's in, I think there's a letter to Mersenne where Descartes says this. Let me see here. Well, maybe I can't find it right now, actually. Oh, no, wait, no, here, no, never mind. Yeah, I might not be able to find that at the moment. Oh, no, here it is. So there's a paper by Schechtman, Descartes' Arguments for the Existence of the Idea of Infinite Being. And so you can find a kind of detailed discussion there. And then it's kind of scattered throughout Descartes' corpus. So I think I've read it in letters to in some of his letters to Mersenne. but I would not bet money on it.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I appreciate that. Back to our attendees' questions. Somebody wants to know what your best advice is for tactics to unflatten the cosmos without falling into the same kinds of error that Henry Moore fell into. Obviously, he writes, obviously piety is not a sufficient safeguard.
How to unflatten that? I mean, I don't really know. Maybe I would. So this actually, Justin Hawkins asked a question, and I think these are actually kind of related. So Justin Hawkins asked, why do you think we should so heavily privilege ideas in the narratives and genealogies of modernity rather than material causes or some synthesis? And the answer to that question is I don't actually think we should privilege ideas. In the version of this, which I'm working on for publication, I make quite clear that I'm speaking only about a very, very small subset of the intellectual elite here when I'm talking about secularity. But to the first question, what do we do to unflatten the cosmos? For the vast majority of people, it's not flat, right? For the vast majority of people, none of this is true. Like they don't see the world this way. Like, so if you read, there's a phenomenal book which I talk about all the time, and my friends are sick of me talking about it. But it's called The Myth of Disenchantment by Jason A. Josephson Storm. And he basically goes through some of these disenchantment narratives and says, like, look, by any metric, the majority of the population in every single part of the world, including the United States, including the European West, is not disenchanted. I mean, people, the majority of Americans believe in ghosts and spirits and witches and, or at least one of them. And it's the same thing in Europe. And in fact, in Europe, belief in spirits and witchcraft and ghosts increased as belief in God decreased. So the vast majority of people are not living in like a flat cosmos. This is like applicable to like a certain subset of the intellectual elite. And so all that to say that the reason I feel like I'm able to isolate ideas for this kind of genealogical project is because academic elites tend to, have their heads, they tend to be eggheads, right? I mean, there's, that's not to say that there aren't material causes for everyone, but it is to say that insofar as there is such a thing as secularity, the only people, if you like list the set of like what secularity is propositionally, the only people who could really be described as holding to these tenets are intellectual elites. Almost no one else does. So I think, the good news is the cosmos is already enchanted for everyone. The key is making sure that it gets enchanted that it's enchanted properly, right? You really don't want to bring back like, fairies and goblins, in the woods and stuff. Like that stuff is nasty. You don't want to, people sort of laugh, but like, Luther walking through the woods thinks the devil is like attacking him. Like that's a terrifying kind of existence. Like enchantment is terrifying. And so I think that Christians who are pro re-enchanting everything, and there's good there too. There's good to that too. But I think should be aware that one, the world is already pretty enchanted for most people, and two, enchantment can be really bad as well as good, right? It can be really scary.
What this is a tough question, I think, but I'll ask it anyway. What should Orthodox Christians believe about space and the possibility of motion?
Oh, I am not at all equipped. I'm not at all equipped to answer that. At all. I mean, so I know a little bit, a very, very little bit about early modern physics. I know almost nothing about contemporary physics. Certainly, like nothing post-Newton. I mean, I've sat in like physics lectures and I leave and I just have no idea what I've heard. So, so I couldn't really tell you what Orthodox Christians should believe about space and motion. I I mean, the one thing I would say though is that I think the cautionary tale that we can get from Henry Moore is that Moore wants to make God accessible to human reason. He's very worried that whether because we're stupid or we're pious, Orthodox Christians who say that God is outside of time and outside of space make atheism more plausible. But I think what Moore shows us is that if we try to make, if in order to sort of make God rationally comprehensible, we try to we bring him in to the order of space and time, we make him subject, so to speak, to various models of physics and motion. And right, so the reason Cartesianism is such a threat to Moore is because Cartesian space has no place for God. There is no place for God in Descartes' three-dimensional world, in the world of things that have essential extension. There is no place for God in that world. And for Descartes, that's not a problem because God isn't in the world. Why would he be? And because Moore needs God to be rationally accessible, part of the comprehensible order of the world, that's terrifying to him. And so he brings God in, but in bringing God in, weirdly makes his doctrine of God like at the mercy of physicists, which just seems, short-sighted if your goal is to defend God. So.
Well, we have this other question by Lane Hancock that I think that you've pretty well answered, but I'll read it anyway. Just piggybacking off of the answer that you just gave in case you want to add a little bit more. On your reading in the dance between Descartes and Moore, which of them took the first decisive step out of the bounds of tradition on the concept of spirit and space? In other words, is Moore reacting or modifying a bad definition from Descartes? Reacting to or modifying it? I think you'd started down that path, but if you want to say a little bit more.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of that depends on your reading of Descartes. So like I said, I think it's Robert Pasnow in his book Metaphysical Themes has a reading of Descartes where Descartes is thoroughly Hellenemerist. Descartes basically agrees with the medieval tradition in all the particulars. So on that reading, Moore misreads Descartes, and Descartes, was never saying a lot of the stuff that Moore thought he was saying, or to be fair, that a lot of Descartes' other readers thought he was saying, right? Like Moore's interpretation of Descartes here is not unique to him. Like the Protestant Orthodox are very, very nervous about Descartes' views. So I mean, on my reading, I think Descartes makes a decisive step against the medieval position. But and this is something that I actually think needs to be studied more. So like in Augustine's Hellenemerism is Neoplatonic, right? He's getting it from Plotinus. But there's a different understanding of the relationship between the soul and the body in Neoplatonism than there is in the kind of Neo-Aristotelian, like Thomistic and Dominican tradition. So one thing I really want to see is the degree to which Hellenemerism as an idea shifts once you have the adoption of Aristotle, once the soul is thought to form the body, right? Because the reason that a figure like Occam is appealing to Hellenemerism, the reason that Hobbes thinks the medievals are appealing to Hellenemerism, the reason that Descartes thinks that medievals are appealing to Hellenemerism is so that you can answer questions like what happens when your hand gets chopped off because the soul is the form of the body. If you don't have that kind of, Neo-Aristotelian conception of the soul-body relationship, it's not clear to me, A, that Hellenemerism is absurd, as later figures thought, but B, like someone like Descartes, I actually see as kind of returning to a more Neoplatonic conception. I mean, this is going to get me in hot water, but I actually think Descartes is probably, closer to the pre-Aristotelian view of this than a lot of his like contemporaries. So I think Descartes probably takes the decisive step, but I don't think it's fair to say that More is just getting his definition of spirit from Descartes and then like inverting it. More is like in conversation with a lot of, had to be in conversation with a lot of his other, with a lot of Protestant Orthodox. And in fact, I need to do more reading here, but the first translation of his Enchiridion Metaphysicum, which is translated into English like 2 years after the original's publication as Henry Moore's Manual of Metaphysics, or maybe, I can't remember when it's translated actually, but the second edition, Moore includes a scholia where he has arguments from people who dislike him and dislike his account of space and spirit in the Enchiridion Metaphysicum, and then responses to those arguments. And there, some of the fiercest opponents of More are the Protestant Orthodox, and he includes counter arguments from them, and then responds to those counter arguments. So that might be a place to look to find out like what the other options on offer for More were. But it bears repeating that More is actually like trained in relatively traditional kind of scholastic methodology at Cambridge, right? The Platonism stuff starts after he starts teaching there. It starts in earnest then. So, presumably he would have had a lot of traditional definitions of soul to work with as well. And he knows that he's not Stoic on the issue. He knows that he's not exactly Platonic on the issue. He's like Pythagorean on the issue, he says. And there are a lot of other people like Gassendi and other figures like that who are proffering their own accounts of space and soul and so on. So there are a lot of other things going on. It's just that More is really obsessed with Descartes, but he's got to know about all of these other ones. So it's not clear to me that he's just sort of taking Descartes' sort of non-traditional definition and then doing something bad with an already innovative definition. Yeah.
All of these excellent questions are coming in our last 10 minutes. Well, I will try and maybe combine a few as I can. So someone wants to know, what does More's approach imply about the revealed knowledge of God?
What does More's approach imply about the revealed knowledge of God? So I haven't done enough reading in More's devotional works to know exactly what he thinks about this, but he does think that the revealed knowledge of God. So one of the things that More, there are kind of debates in earlier More scholarship about how rationalist More is. One of the things I think he's actually understood to be too rationalistic by some of his interpreters. He's very clear once he becomes a Neoplatonist that the purification of the soul has to precede knowledge of divine things. So knowledge, he says, is only a benefit if it helps you to be more pious, more loving to God. But also you can only truly know if your soul is already purified. So when it comes to things like the scriptures, for example, More writes to Anne Conway that that scripture is a stumbling block to the sinners and those who do not worship God. They can't understand it because their souls are impure. I think for More, revelation is revelation, scripture is scripture. Now, he has like some kind of interesting Kabbalistic views. Everyone's kind of obsessed with Kabbalah at More's time, like in his circles, like Anne Conway, has like a Kabbalistic proof of the Trinity. More does this Kabbalistic interpretation of Genesis 1-3. And part of their quote unquote Kabbalistic reading is like a mystical interpretation of scripture. So More gives a kind of threefold reading of Genesis. There's the literal sense, the moral sense, and the mystical sense. Excuse me. But he thinks that scripture is true, that it's revealed by God, and he thinks that you have to be purified to approach it rightly. So in that respect, he's actually kind of pretty traditional as a Protestant, right? That like Scripture is perspicuous, but only if you're illuminated by the Holy Spirit when you come to it. Like the unbeliever is not going to be able to sort of understand and appropriate for himself the truths of salvation without the Holy Spirit sort of working in and through Scripture to kind of illumine his mind or something. Yeah.
I think this gives us a segue into our next question. Should a doctrine of space be part of Christian piety? That is, does the More story teach us to avoid engagement with contemplation of space? Most Christians don't think about space. Is this a good strategy? I
mean, I think most Christians are probably well served by and by most Christians, I mean, I think a lot of us are curious in the sort of negative sense of the term. Like there's this sort of desire to play with ideas that we don't really know how to handle. So, I mean, in that sense, like, I really don't think most Christians should be like, reflecting on like trying to figure out how God and the newest, models of physics, that physicists are working with, should be understood to like, work together. But I do know, and I think it's really great that there are a lot of like, Christian philosophers of science who are doing, stuff on eternity and time and space. And they're like, dialoguing with physicists. And I think that's fantastic. I think we should absolutely be doing that sort of thing. But, I mean, that something like that is probably beyond most of our capacities, I mean, so if other people, who perhaps are more capable than I are interested in that sort of thing, they should absolutely do it. But for the rest of us, I'm gonna, sit on the sidelines and read other people's thoughts on that sort of thing with interest. But
you see a parallel between More and some contemporary Christian analytic philosophers who depart from traditional understandings of Christian doctrines, such as divine simplicity or the Trinity, to make them more defensible?
Yeah, probably, I think. Although, it's not clear to me that Christian philosophers are doing it from the same motivation, right? Like if you read Plantinga has this small book on, I forget what it is, but it's a small book on divine simplicity. It's like a series of lectures from like the 80s or something. And if you read there, he departs from the traditional doctrine. Well, first, it's not clear that he really understands the traditional doctrine. I think that's a lot of it, is that a lot of analytic philosophers aren't really trained in what like the medieval and like non sort of new philosophy, early modern philosophy means when it says a lot of this stuff. And Richard Muller actually has a section on that, I think, in his post-Reformation Reform Dogmatics, where he kind of goes through what the actual Orthodox divines meant by simplicity, and then talks about how Plantinga's discussion of simplicity, Plantinga thinks they mean something other than what they think, because he's right that it would be absurd if they thought what he thought they thought, or whatever. So I think some of it's just like mutual incomprehension. Like if you talk to an analytic philosopher in a philosophy department, and you talk to them about a Thomist, they're like, they don't really know, Thomism has its own sort of way of its own kind of jargon. And there's some like analytic Thomists, who are trying to like bring the two worlds together. But in general, like the Thomists have their own kind of philosophical, like method, manners, speech, sets of assumptions and stuff. And analytics have their own, and they don't really know what to do with each other. Like, I've met a lot of Thomists who don't like analytic philosophers, a lot of analytic philosophers who are, happy to return the favor. But it's not clear to me how much of it is like kind of mutual incomprehension, and then the analytic philosophers are like trying to reinvent the wheel because or how much of it is them finding real spots of tension in at least traditional ways of articulating the Orthodox doctrine of God, So I'm not really an expert on that, but it seems to me that those are some plausible readings of why things are the way they are between the two communities. So
Very good. Well, I think we might have time for one more question. Onsi, do you have anything to say about Stoic metaphysics?
I do not. I do know that there's like a revival of Stoic physics at Moore's time, like, or not revival necessarily in the sense that people are championing the Stoic view, but they're aware of it. But I don't really know much about the way that Stoicism is being interpreted in Moore's time now.
Okay. Somebody wants to know if there's a connection between Moore and Stoic metaphysics where a cosmic fire or pneuma underlies all matter and God within the cosmos.
I don't think so. Moore thinks that he is adopting the position of the Pythagoreans on space, not the position of the Stoics. And Moore certainly doesn't think that anything underlies God. So there's nothing logically prior to or sort of ontologically more basic than God for Moore. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's about all the time that we have. So thank you to everyone who joined us, and thank you to all future watchers and listeners of this lecture. This will be available on YouTube and on all podcasting platforms. Just search for the Davenant Institute. If you would like more of Mr. Kamel, he is currently teaching a course with Davenant Hall called Augustine's Anthropology, Ethics, and Politics, and he is the editor-in-chief of the Davenant Press and has written many wonderful introductions to some of our volumes and will continue to serve in that role in the future. So thank you to everyone who has joined us. Onsi, thank you for that wonderful lecture. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Mike.